Hello, welcome to another episode of Critic.Reading.Writing. My name is Quayson, and I'm a professor of English at Stanford University. Today I want to talk about the relationship between time and memory in Beloved, a novel by Toni Morrison. And today I'm focusing specifically on the character of Sethe. Now, as we saw from the previous episode, the novel is set in the period 1873 to 1874. This is where the majority of the events at the foreground of the novel occur. But some of the events also occurred in 1855, 1856, when Sethe and Paul D and the other slaves were on Sweet Home Farm. Now, in the novel, as we saw also from the earlier episode, Sethe decapitates her daughter and attempts to kill her three other children. And this is to prevent them from being taken back into slavery. Now, the infanticide of the children immediately calls to mind Euripides' Medea. And in fact, it has been commented upon many times by different commentators that Sethe is reminiscent of Medea. This is true, of course, but there's a very important difference between Medea and Sethe. And that is that in Euripides' play, Medea actually reflects very slowly and deliberately on what she's going to do. Basically, she wants to kill her two sons to spite her ex-husband, Jason. Not only does she deliberate on it, she tells the gathered chorus what she's going to do, her reasoning, her rationale, and they try to persuade her not to do it. Now, Sethe's killing of her daughter, however, is done on the spur of the moment. She has no time to think at all. She spots the slave master and the horsemen coming, and she immediately gathers all her children and rushes them into the barn behind 124, and then she proceeds to do what is so tragic in the novel. But precisely because her act is on the spur of the moment and she's not allowed to think before she acts, precisely because of this, we're obliged to insert her act into a larger framework of interpretation. And it is this that makes us interpret her act in relation to slavery more generally. In other words, Sethe is similar to Medea, but she's also quite different. Medea is killing her sons to spite her husband. Sethe is killing her children to save them from slavery. Very different ideas. Now, when Sethe kills her daughter, she is arrested, she's put in jail for a period of time, and she's released. But what surprises the community, the small Black community in Cincinnati, is that Sethe expresses no regret whatsoever. She holds her head up very proudly and she continues to live her life. This leads to resentment on the part of the community. In fact, Sethe holds her head up high because she doesn't want anyone to pity her. Now, this absolute lack of regret seems to go completely counter to whatever maternal instincts she was trying to express in killing her daughter. And so we wonder what is going on with Sethe that she represses any form of expression of regret or even guilt. She seems completely guiltless. Now, one way of explaining it is that she feels guiltless because she was saving them from death. And if she was saving them from the death that was slavery, why should she regret? But actually, there's a more complex explanation. On the surface, she is not regretting, but in fact, her mind is always in turmoil. It is overpopulated by all kinds of images, and her um, memory protocols are completely scrambled. And this is what I want us to pay attention to. At some point in the novel, uh, Sethe's daughter, her only remaining child with her, whose name is Denver. Denver comes into the house, but as she's entering the house, she sees her mother kneeling in prayer. Something also uncanny she sees in addition. There is the silhouette of a white dress holding her mother by the waist. Now, this silhouette turns out to be a premonitory sign of the ghost spirit that enters the novel. The ghost spirit being the spirit of a beloved, but that's not what we're talking about today. So Denver comes into the house and they have a very important conversation. And this is what we see. Like you, it looked just like you, kneeling next to you while you were praying, had its arm around your waist. Well, I'll be. What were you praying for, ma'am? Not for anything. I don't pray anymore. I just talk. What were you talking about? You won't understand, baby. Yes, I will. I was talking about time. It's so hard for me to believe in it. Some things go, pass on. Some things just stay. I used to think it was my rememory. Some things you forget, other things you never do. But it's not. Places are there still. If a house burns down, it's gone. But the place, the picture of it, stays. And not just in my rememory, but out there in the world. What I remember is a picture floating around there outside my head. I mean, even if I don't think it, even if I die, the picture of what I did or knew or saw is still out there, right in the place where it happened. Can other people see it? Asked Denver. Oh, yes. Oh, yes, yes, yes. Someday you'll be walking down the road and you hear something or see something going on. So clear. And you think it's you thinking it up, a thought picture. But no, it's when you bump into a rememory that belongs to somebody else. Where I was before I came here, that place is real. It's never going away. Even if the whole farm, every tree and grass blade of it dies, the picture is still there. And what's more, if you go there, you who never was there, if you go there and stand in the place where it was, it will happen again. It will be there for you, waiting for you. So Denver, you can't never go there. Never! Because even though it's all over and done with, it's going to always be there waiting for you. That's how come I had to get all my children out, no matter what. Denver picked at her fingernails. If it's still there waiting, that must mean that nothing ever dies. Sethe looked right in Denver's face. nothing ever does, she said. Now, this passage on rememory, Sethe talking to her child, her daughter asks her, "What are you praying for?" And she says, "I was not praying. I was just talking." "What were you talking about?" And she says, "I was just talking about time." Now, her description of time is extremely pregnant with all kinds of implications. Because what she's saying is that in the traumatic event, the events of slavery, there is a leakage of the traumatic detail. There's a leakage of affect into time. And that leakage binds the negative affect to time and makes that time of the moment live in spite of the passage of the past. Not only that, you can bump into it. You might think it's a deja vu, but it can't be a deja vu because it is not a thought picture from your own mind. It is something that occurred to, in this case, someone you love, like your mother, that you bump into. So that the rememory implies that the effect of violence and traumatic events is to recode time. There's actually another implication out of Sethe's notion of rememory. And the implication is that rememory implies that time does not flow like a river, but rather time is granulated. It's like granules, and that each granule subsists in itself as a container of the event, in this case, the traumatic event. And so for Sethe, Heraclitus's statement, Heraclitus says, you cannot step in the same river twice. For Sethe's response would be quite the opposite. You can bump into the same moment more than once because the negative affect has leaked into history. Now, this, as it were, philosophy of time, because we might actually say that Sethe is a philosopher of time. This philosophy of time is very fascinating because even though she's speaking about Sweet Home Farm, so she tells her daughter, you can't never go there because even if the place burns down and you go and stand there, the thing will happen again. It will happen to you, so you can never go there. Even though she's specifically talking about her experiences on Sweet Home Farm, rememory also requires us to rethink the moment of her killing of her daughter. Because if her philosophy of time is true and appropriate to the experience of a violated slave woman, then it also implies that her action to kill her daughter also leaks into time. And so Denver can bump into it. Now, of course, Denver does not bump into it. There's no occasion where Denver walks through that emotional moment. However, the rememory of the event does affect the way that Sethe herself experiences time. And so the next thing I'm going to read is Sethe's experience of time. And the experience of time is very much rememorialized. So her experience of time is a feature of the rememorialization of time that she herself has philosophized for us. This passage I'm going to read occurs really early in the novel, in its first 5 or 6 pages. Unfortunately, her brain was devious. She might be hurrying across a field, running practically, to get to the pump quickly and rinse the chamomile sap from her legs. Nothing else would be in her mind. The picture of the man coming to nurse her was as lifeless as the nerves in her back where the skin buckled like a washboard. Nor was there the faintest scent of ink or the cherry gum and oak bark from which it was made. Nothing. Just the breeze cooling her face as she rushed toward water. And then sopping the chamomile away with pump water and rags, her mind fixed on getting every last bit of sap off, on her carelessness in taking a shortcut across the field just to save a half mile, and not noticing how high the wheat had grown until the itching was all the way to her knees. Then something, the plash of water, the sight of her shoes and stockings awry on the path where she had flung them, or hear boy lapping in the puddle near her feet. And suddenly there was Sweet Home rolling, rolling, rolling out before her eyes. And although there was not a leaf on that farm that did not make her want to scream, it rolled itself out before her in shameless beauty. It never looked as terrible as it was, and it made her wonder if hell was a pretty place too. Fire and brimstone, all right, but hidden in lacy groves. Boys hanging from the most beautiful sycamores in the world. It shamed her, remembering the wonderful sowing trees rather than the boys. Try as she might to make it otherwise, the sycamores beat out the children every time, and she could not forgive her memory for that. Now, this passage is extraordinarily suggestive about the relationship between time and memory for Sethe. As we see, she's just walking, she may be just walking along, her mind fixed on getting home, on washing her feet or her hands. And then suddenly, something completely banal, like the plash of water, or here boys, her dog, lapping about the pool. And then suddenly, without warning, because that's the key thing, the return of the image, the thought picture of Sweet Home is not cued for her. There's no cue that this is coming so that she can prepare herself. Then all of a sudden, she is overwhelmed by these images. The images are so vivid that she can remember every tiny detail. Not only that, some things, such as the beauty of the trees, the sycamore trees, beats out the men that were hanging from those trees. In other words, it's as if the thought picture also obliterates the violence involved in the thought picture and replaces it with aesthetic beauty. And she finds this, it's very worrying, she says, that we are told. She feels ashamed by the fact that she can remember the sycamore trees, but the boys hanging from the trees, they're somehow blurred. She cannot remember them. Now, this extraordinary passage also allows us to revisit the question of rememory. And in addition, also think a little bit about how guilty is Beloved. Because as we saw earlier, she expresses no regret, no guilt, no apologies to anyone for killing her daughter. Now, even though she doesn't express any such apologies, her own philosophy of history allows us to see how these thought pictures come upon her. In this particular case, is the thought picture of Sweet Home Farm. But the thought picture of Sweet Home Farm comes also trailing residues of violence. The affective content of the trauma has been residualized in that moment represented by Sweet Home, and it comes upon her and washes her over with the ill will and the bad feeling mixed up, of course, with the sense of beauty in the trees. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that the mechanics of recall, as we noted a moment ago, there is no explicit cue that shows her that this is coming to me. It's something casual, like the plash of water. Actually, what this tells us is that the present, the present of her sensory perceptions, the sound of water, the smell of ink, and so on. So all these sensory indices are then overwhelmed by sensory indices from the past. So she's walking home and she's thinking of this and that and hearing the sound of water and so on. And these sensory indices in the past are then overcome by, or overwhelmed, better still, by sensory indices so sensory indices in the present are overwhelmed by sensory indices of the past. What then happens is that the sensory indices of the past produce forms of emotional intensity that are attached to the present moment. The present moment is arrested by the past, and the affective leakage from the past comes to intensify her experience of the present moment. Therefore, Sethe is never actually free of the traumatic content because the present is arrested by the past, and the past recodes the casualness of the everyday with those emotional intensities. Now, what I have just read, what we've tried to explain, is repeated in different guises throughout the novel. And not just, oddly enough, not just for Sethe. Different characters also have this overwhelming washing over of the past upon the present. What I'm interested in, though, is what this tells us about rememory and its relationship to history, the past, and to Sethe. Because throughout the novel, Sethe cannot control what is going to wash over her. The past washes over her several times. In other words, she's a victim of the past. The only point where she is not a victim of rememory is at the very end. And the very end is really fascinating because the beloved, the spirit child, has returned and has lived with Sethe, Denver, and Paul D. And a series of events happen. But gradually, Sethe comes to recognize that this woman who has returned is actually the spirit of my daughter. And so Sethe begins to try to explain to beloved why what happened did happen and how much she loves her. But part of the explanation also involves giving beloved anything that she wants. And so as the novel progresses, this is in the last third of the novel, Sethe stops eating. And she's just feeding, beloved. And gradually, beloved begins to become fat. She grows very plump, while her mother grows thinner and thinner and lacks energy. And Denver is a witness of what is happening. At any rate, at a certain point, Denver realizes that if she doesn't do something to save her mother, beloved is going to suck the life out of her, literally. Sethe is completely wanting to sacrifice herself, but what she's sacrificing is not just her body. She's trying to reproduce explanations to prove to beloved how much she loves her. So she tells beloved lots of stories. So she's feeding beloved, but she's also feeding her stories about maternal love and how much I love you and so on. Beloved is oblivious. She's sucking the stories and also every food and everything in the house. Denver leaves the house and goes to notify the woman in the neighborhood that this is what is happening at 124. The women gather and they come to exorcise the spirit of beloved. The exorcism itself is quite interesting because the ritual of exorcism takes the women, the gathered women, 30 or so of them, back into a moment in the past before Sethe decapitates her daughter. And in that moment of recall, of recollection, they rememory themselves younger, obviously beautiful, but without envy. Because what happens 18 years previously is that Baby Sachs throws a party, and the party is so generous that they become envious that a former slave woman can express so much generosity. And because they are envious, the following day, when the four horsemen arrive, no one runs to give the household warning. And so it turns out that the entire community is also afflicted by guilt. But we don't know this until the moment of exorcism. And so when the women gather before Sethe's house and they start to chant and to exorcise, they are also exorcising their ill will. They rememorize that party moment. They rememorize themselves younger, much more lively, and most definitely not envious. But at the same time, coincidentally, as they rememorize themselves younger and so on, Sethe steps out of the house and sees a white man in a hat coming. And she immediately thinks that it is the slave master coming again to take her children from her. This is the first time that Sethe is not the victim of her own memories. But when she sees the white man coming, his name is Bodwin. When she sees the white man coming, it is as if she activates the rememory of the previous instance when the slave master is coming to take her children. But instead of grabbing her kids and running into the barn to try and kill them all, she takes her frustration outward and attempts to attack Bodwin. She attacks him with an ice pick, and she's disarmed. But as soon as she's disarmed, it's as if she is freed from the trance of history. And this then implies that she has altered her agential role in that traumatic history, so that both her and the community, which have of course rememoried the past and removed the ill will from that rememory, both her and the gathering of women are freed from the traumatic rememory. The thing to take from this scene, and indeed from the novel Beloved in general, is the demand that history makes on us to first acknowledge it. It's very important. Violent, traumatic, slavery, and so on, is to first acknowledge it, but not to submit to it as victims. So to acknowledge it in all its horrific dimensions, but not to submit to it as victims, but to learn from it in order to alter our agential roles today. This is how to learn from history. So the philosophy of time and history that Toni Morrison delivers to us in Beloved enjoins alertness, acknowledgement, but also an active engagement in the now. So these are some of the lessons that we learn from Toni Morrison's exquisite novel, Beloved. Thank you very much. See you next week, and remember to subscribe and share.